By November of 1950, General MacArthur, as well as the other leaders of the United States-led coalition, were preparing to set up a unified Korean state. And then, the unthinkable happened. Over 200,000 Chinese troops entered the war-torn peninsula. Across the world's largest ocean in Washington, D.C., nobody expected this, because China was just born. It was weak, destroyed from 2 decades of civil warfare, and without economic value. Mao Zedong's task in this environment was the creation of a Chinese state that would compete with the United States and the USSR on an equal level. The chairman decided to ally himself with the Russian communists to the north in order to gain from them money, technology, and a nuclear umbrella to protect the new China from attack. Mao, though, had to establish himself in a Soviet bloc led by Joseph Stalin, a man who only cared for the starts and ends of his power as dictator of the USSR. All the money, science, and technology that crossed Stalin's southeastern border had to be approved of by Stalin and had to benefit him and his empire. Luckily for the Soviet leader, Mao was willing to play ball and proved his devotion to the communist struggle to which the Soviet dictator was founder, as well as to the unity and power of the communist bloc by sustaining very nearly 500,000 casualties to keep Korea at least partially under communist control. To Stalin, China's entry was useful. Were Korea to be an ally to the United States, both Mao and Stalin's territories would border this American ally and would be directly exposed to the United States military. As leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin couldn't just fight the Americans outright, because that could risk nuclear war, since only him and the United States had nuclear weapons. His Chinese ally, however, who had no nuclear weapons, could do just that, with Stalin suffering minimal casualties. The fear of Americans touching the Chinese and Soviet borders is also what led the chairman to also support the communists in Vietnam, the country bordering mainland China, to prevent the United States military from setting up shop. To the southwest, Mao also had another bone to pick: India. The invasion of Tibet served to protect the invader's country against the influence of India. With Tibet secured, fights between India's troops and Mao's would take place on the Himalayas, where neither side would have a great advantage, and where the Chinese population center was protected by the world's tallest mountains from a hypothetical Indian incursion. Meanwhile, to the north, tensions were brewing between the USSR and Communist China. The Soviet Union, who was the founder of the Communist bloc, saw itself as the sole leader of the bloc, and as having a higher authority than any other state, including China. Mao did not take this disrespect, especially when Nikita Khrushchev, the USSR's new head of state, claimed the policy of de-Stalinization and of coexisting with the non-communist countries. Mao believed in continuous revolution, and so this coexistence Khrushchev spoke of was blasphemous to the chairman. On top of that, Mao kept a more flamboyant tone on nuclear weapons. When talking with a visitor from Yugoslavia in 1957, he said, quote, "We have a very large territory and a big population. Atomic bombs could not kill all of us. What if they killed 300 million of us? We would still have many people left." Mao's purpose was to appear so indifferent to nuclear annihilation so as to appear stronger than he actually was, and scare his enemies into not opposing China, even as his country was much weaker than any other nuclear power. This tone in regards to nukes, though, did scare, especially the USSR, who had an interest in coexistence and not getting involved in nuclear conflict with the capitalist world. Meanwhile, the communists in Moscow also started to become friendly with the Chinese enemies in New Delhi, all of which only made the communists in Beijing even more indignant. Soon, there were disputes and skirmishes all across the Sino-Soviet border, and the prospect of war between the USSR and Communist China looked to be very probable. Back in Washington, though, the Americans were concerned. On the one hand, the Americans viewed both communists as enemies, and did not care much about what happened to either, so long as America and its allies were fine. On the other hand, however, The Nixon administration realized that a Soviet takeover of the People's Republic of China would mean that the USSR would have complete control of China as a puppet state, which would give the government in Moscow control of China's massive population and resources, which it could then project against the United States. Moreover, Mao had dug himself into a hole. He was enemies with all of his neighbors, and especially his former Soviet allies. As a result, he looked to the United States to help pull him out of this hole by serving as a deterrent against the USSR from invading China. Were the Soviets to invade Mao's country, they likely could have overrun it due to it being weak and in chaos from Mao's own disastrous leadership in the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. If the Chinese fighters were backed by the Americans' military or diplomacy, however, then that fight would be much more difficult. Having these interests in common, America announced that it would lean to supporting the People's Republic of China in the event of a conflict between it and the Soviets, which helped lead the way to recognizing the communist government in the 1970s and undermine Soviet power and the overall unity of the communist bloc.